The dog wasn't broken. That was the first thing Corporal Vince Hargrove got wrong. The second thing he got wrong was assuming the woman standing at the edge of the training compound, the one with the mud-spattered field boots and the laminated clearance badge, still swinging from being clipped on in a hurry, had no business being there. He got a lot of things wrong that Tuesday morning, but those two were the ones that cost him. The compound at CFB Trenton sat behind two chain-link fences and a keypad gate that nobody had bothered to update since 2019. It was one of those grey October mornings that Canada does particularly well. Not raining, not cold enough to complain about, just flat and colourless and businesslike. The kind of sky that made everything underneath it look serious whether it wanted to or not. There were 6 men in the yard when Lieutenant Brooke Callery arrived. 6 men, 1 dog, and a problem that had apparently been building for 3 weeks. The dog's name was Orca. He was a Belgian Malinois, 5 years old, 71 pounds of muscle and scar tissue and something else. Something that none of the men in that yard had a name for yet, though they'd been arguing about it since the first week of September. His coat was darker than most Malinois, almost black along the spine, with fawn colouring that barely showed through at the chest and jaw. His eyes were amber, not golden. Amber, the kind of colour that holds light rather than reflects it, the way old glass holds light in the afternoon. He had been Handler Sergeant Cole Brentwood's dog for 3 years. Cole Brentwood had been killed in a training exercise gone wrong outside of Wainwright, Alberta, 6 weeks ago. A vehicle rollover. Nothing dramatic, nothing that made sense for a man who had survived 4 overseas deployments and 2 blown IEDs to die in a field exercise 40 minutes from base. Orca had been with him. Nobody knew exactly what the dog had witnessed. They only knew what came after. The biting, the refusal to work, the nights when the kennel staff heard him crying and nobody went in because the last person who had tried ended up needing 14 stitches from elbow to wrist. 3 weeks into the assessment period, Major Darren Fitch had called Orca a liability. 1 week after that, he'd started the paperwork. Brooke Callery found out about the paperwork through a phone call she wasn't supposed to receive from a veterinary technician at the base she wasn't supposed to know, who left a message that said only, "They're going to put him down Friday if no one comes." She drove 4 hours from Barrie. She didn't call ahead. She was 29 years old. She had a degree in animal behavior from Guelph and a postgraduate certification in military working dog handling from a program so new it barely had an alumni network yet. She had worked with 3 different dog units in her career, 2 RCMP, 1 military, and she had never lost a dog to a behavioral assessment she didn't agree with. Not once. She had also trained Orca, not all of it, not the tactical work that had been Cole's domain, the bite work and the vehicle searches and the controlled aggression that turned a driven animal into something the military could point at a problem and trust. But the foundation, the early months, the sit and the stay and the first time Orca had learned that a human hand could mean food rather than threat, that had been Brooke. She had been 24 then. Orca had been 8 weeks old and smelled like puppy and cedar shavings and had chewed through 2 of her shoelaces in the first afternoon. She hadn't told anyone at the compound about any of this. She arrived at 0740, signed in at the guard post with a clearance that made the duty corporal look at her badge twice, and walked to the training yard with her field notebook under her arm and her hands in her jacket pockets against the October chill. She heard Orca before she saw him, not barking. That surprised people when they learned about it later. They expected barking, aggression, the sounds of a dangerous animal, but Orca wasn't making threatening sounds. He was making the sound of a dog who had been waiting for something that hadn't come. A low, intermittent whine, barely audible under the wind, the kind of sound that an untrained ear might miss entirely. Brooke didn't miss it. She stopped at the fence line and looked through the chain link at the yard beyond. Orca was in the far corner of the exercise pen, a space about 30 meters by 20, with training obstacles along one wall and a rubber bite sleeve lying in the dirt where someone had dropped it and not picked it back up. The dog was sitting, not pacing, not lunging at the fence, sitting the way a dog sits when it has made a decision about waiting and intends to keep making that decision regardless of how long it takes. One of the men in the yard noticed her. "Can I help you?" His tone made it clear he was hoping the answer was no. He was Corporal Vince Hargrove. She knew this because she had looked up everyone assigned to the unit before she drove down, the same way she had looked up the assessment timeline and the incident reports and the name of the veterinarian who had signed the preliminary euthanasia recommendation. She liked to know what she was walking into. "I'm here about the dog," she said. "The dog's under assessment," Hargrove said. "Restricted access." "I have clearance," she said, and showed him the badge again. He looked at it. He looked at her, the field notebook, the muddy boots, the fact that she was a woman in her late 20s who had apparently driven here alone and unannounced on a Tuesday morning with a laminated badge and an expression that suggested she wasn't planning to be redirected. "Assessment's almost done," he said. "Decision's been made. Has it been signed?" A pause. "Not yet." "Then it hasn't been made," she said. "I'd like to observe the dog." Major Darren Fitch arrived at the compound at 0820 and was told by 2 different people in the first 5 minutes that there was a woman in the training yard who claimed to have clearance and wouldn't leave. He found her standing at the fence of the exercise pen with her notebook open, watching Orca with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not clinical, not emotional, something in between. The dog had moved since the morning. He was no longer in the corner. He was standing about 8 meters from the fence, which was closer than he'd been to a human in 3 weeks, and his amber eyes were fixed on the woman. Not the threat stare. Fitch had seen the threat stare. He'd been there when Orca had turned it on Corporal Aldridge, and the subsequent bite had sent Aldridge to the medical center for most of an afternoon. This was something else. "Lieutenant Callery," Fitch said, reading her rank off the badge. "Major," she said without turning around. "Thank you for coming. I was told you walked in without an appointment." "I called the duty desk before I left Barry. I was told to submit a request in writing. I submitted a request in writing at 11:30 last night. I didn't hear back, so I came in person." She paused. "The dog is scheduled for Friday. The dog is a liability. He's injured 2 handlers, and he failed every assessment point in the last 3 weeks. The decision isn't signed," she said. "You told Corporal Hargrove it wasn't signed." Fitch stopped. He looked at Hargrove, who had been standing slightly to the left and behind, and who suddenly appeared to wish he were somewhere else entirely. "I'd like 20 minutes with him," Brooke said. "That's all. 20 minutes in the yard, and if I can't demonstrate a change in his responsiveness, I'll leave and I won't file a challenge to the assessment. And if you can, then I'd like to discuss alternatives to euthanasia." She finally turned from the fence to look at him directly. Her eyes were steady and very calm, the way water is calm when there's depth under it. "He's not a dangerous dog, Major. He's a grieving one. Those aren't the same thing." Fitch looked at the dog. Orca had taken 2 steps toward the fence while they were talking. 2 steps, voluntary, unprovoked, eyes still fixed on the woman with the notebook. 20 minutes, Fitch said. Hargrove found him afterward in the observation bay and said, with the particular tone of a man who has already lost an argument but hasn't fully accepted it yet. "Sir, with respect, she's some kind of contractor. We don't know her credentials." "Her credentials are filed with CFMWD," Fitch said. "I had my admin pull them while she was suiting up," and Fitch was quiet for a moment. "She trained that dog," he said. "Foundation training, puppy to 11 months. She was the primary handler before he went to operational conditioning." He paused. "She's the one who named him." Hargrove opened his mouth, closed it. "She named him Orca," Fitch said, "because at 8 weeks old he had a black saddle pattern that she said looked like a killer whale, and she thought it was funny. Brentwood kept the name. Another silence. "Nobody told us that," Hargrove said. "Nobody asked her," Fitch said. What happened in the exercise yard in the next 20 minutes would be described differently by every person who watched it. Corporal Aldridge, whose arm still carried the bandaging from 3 weeks prior, said later that he expected her to get hurt. He was not ashamed to admit this. He said it plainly to the 2 people who asked him about it in the days afterward, and he said it without malice. He had gone into that yard with Orca twice. He was trained, experienced, and he'd been bitten hard enough to leave a scar. He watched Brooke Callery step through the gate with nothing but her field notebook and her jacket, and he genuinely believed she was about to make a very serious mistake. Sergeant Yolanda Price, the only other woman assigned to the unit, said she watched the dog's body language shift before Brooke was even fully inside the fence line. She said she knew. In that moment, that whatever was about to happen was not going to be what anyone expected. Major Fitch said only that it was the most efficient piece of behavioral work he had ever witnessed in a military animal context, and that he put that in writing in his incident report, and that he stood by it. What they all agreed on was this: Brooke did not rush. She came through the gate and she stood still. She didn't face the dog directly. She angled her body sideways, a body language cue so subtle that half the observers at the fence didn't register it consciously, though they felt it somehow, the way a room feels different when someone in it relaxes. She held her notebook at her side. She didn't speak. Orca was at the far end of the yard. He turned to look at her. For 23 seconds, Aldridge counted, because he was that kind of person. Nothing happened. The dog stood. The woman stood. The October wind moved through the compound in a low sweep that stirred the dead grass at the base of the chain link and lifted a corner of the bite sleeve lying in the dirt. Then Brooke said one word, just one. Quiet enough that the men at the fence couldn't make it out clearly. A name maybe, or a command, or something in between. Something in the specific register of voice that she and a very particular Belgian Malinois had established 5 years ago in a training facility outside of Guelph before either of them had any idea what they were building toward. Orca's ears came forward. His entire body, which had been held in that particular rigid stillness of a dog in grief, all the energy turned inward, all the expression locked down, seemed to change. Not dramatically. Not the way it looks in films, where a single moment transforms everything. It was smaller than that and larger than that at the same time. His tail moved, once, tentatively, then again. He took a step toward her, then another. Then he was moving, not the explosive sprint of an aggression response, but something else, something closer to the gait of a dog who has been waiting in one place for a very long time and has finally understood that the waiting is over, and then he was at her feet, and his head was pressed against her leg, and Brooke Callery put her hand on the back of his neck and didn't move, and didn't speak, and the yard was very quiet. Hargrove at the fence said nothing. Aldridge at the fence said nothing. Major Fitch, who had been in the Canadian Armed Forces for 19 years, and who had watched men and women do remarkable things in difficult circumstances, cleared his throat once, quietly, and looked away for a moment at the flat grey October sky. The debrief lasted 90 minutes. It was supposed to last 30. Brooke sat across from Fitch and 2 of his senior NCOs and explained, with the same steady patience she had shown at the fence line, what she believed had happened to Orca over the past 6 weeks. She was not gentle about it. That was what Sergeant Price remembered most clearly afterward. Not the content, but the manner. Brooke Callery was not unkind, but she was precise in the way that people are precise when they have been careful about something for a long time and are done being careful about it. "He's been in an environment that kept responding to his grief with force," she said. "Every time he showed distress, the response was restraint or correction. Every time he showed aggression, which was his distress, they're the same signal, you just need to know how to read it. The response escalated the stimulus." She set her notebook on the table. "You trained the one handler who could reach him. Then you lost that handler. Then you put the dog in a box and started a clock. Fitch was quiet. We followed assessment protocol. Protocol was written for dogs who failed behaviorally, she said. Orca hasn't failed. He's been failed. A beat. There's a difference. And if we're going to talk about what happens next, we need to agree on that difference first. Fitch looked at his NCOs. One of them, Warrant Officer Desmond Farrar, a quiet man with a greying beard who had said almost nothing in the first hour of the debrief, was looking at Brooke with an expression that was hard to read, but was not hostile. What happens next, Fitch said slowly, would require a modified rehabilitation protocol. Additional resource allocation, time 6 to 8 weeks, Brooke said. And a primary handler he can form a working bond with, not a rotation. One person, consistent contact, patient approach. And you? Fitch said. Are you volunteering? She had thought about this on the drive down. She had thought about it, actually, for the 4 hours from Barrie through the grey farmland of eastern Ontario and the long stretch of highway where the trees had already gone bare and the sky sat low and the radio had cycled through the same 3 songs twice. She had thought about what it would mean, the contract, the reassignment, the months away from her current position. She had also thought about Orca at 8 weeks old, asleep in a crate lined with an old army blanket, his tiny black-saddled sides rising and falling, and the way he had looked up at her when she opened the crate door that first morning, as if she were the most expected thing in the world. Yes, she said, it was not immediate. Nothing about it was immediate. The paperwork alone took 11 days. There were 3 separate approval requests. 1 conference call with a CFMWD senior officer in Ottawa who had concerns about the liability implications and who spent 45 minutes on the phone outlining those concerns before Brooke systematically addressed each one, and he eventually said, a little grudgingly, that he would pass the recommendation up the chain. There were 2 veterinary assessments. There was a formal reversal of the euthanasia paperwork, which required signatures from Fitch, the base veterinary officer, and someone in Ottawa whose title Brooke never fully caught. Through all of it, Orca waited. She visited every day. She was not assigned to the base yet. The contract hadn't cleared, but she had been given visitor access, and she used it with the same quiet consistency she brought to everything else. She didn't bring the notebook. She sat outside the kennel run with her back to the chain link, letting him approach on his terms, talking sometimes in a low, unhurried voice about nothing in particular. The drive down, the weather, a podcast she'd been listening to about migratory birds, the particular indignity of a Tim Hortons coffee that had been sitting in a cup holder for 2 hours. Aldridge passed the kennel block one afternoon and heard her talking and stopped, just for a moment at the corner. He couldn't see into the run from where he stood. What he could see was the shadow of the dog against the concrete, sitting close to the chain link, close to the voice on the other side of it. He went back to his bunk and didn't tell anyone what he'd seen, though he thought about it, on and off, for the rest of the week. The first time Brooke took Orca into the exercise yard after the contract cleared, Hargrove was there. He hadn't planned to be. He'd been on his way through to the equipment shed and had stopped at the gate when he saw her leading the dog out on a loose lead, no tension in the line, Orca moving at her left shoulder with the specific, focused ease of a working dog who knows where it is and trusts what it's doing. Hargrove watched for a few minutes. He was not a man given to admissions as a rule. He had opinions, and he held them, and he modified them only under significant evidential pressure, and sometimes not even then. He had told 3 people in the first week, after Brooke arrived, that she was going to get someone hurt, that the Wadog was past the point of rehabilitation, that whatever she thought she's up as was sentiment dressed up as science. He still believed some of that. The part about sentiment, mostly. He still thought that sentiment had driven her here, that it was not purely professional judgment that had sent her down that highway from Barrie with her notebook and her muddy boots. But he had been watching a dog, that 3 weeks ago would not allow a human being within 5 meters of its kennel run sitting calmly at a woman's left heel, and the sentiment, if that's what it was, seemed to be working. He went to the equipment shed. He came back out 10 minutes later. She was running Orca through the obstacle course. Not the tactical training, just the basic sequence, the kind of thing a handler and a working dog do to establish communication, to remind each other of shared vocabulary. Jump, tunnel, platform, down. And again, the dog moved cleanly, responded crisply, checked in with her at each station with a glance that was not the blank mechanical compliance of rote training, but something more alive than that. Hargrove leaned against the fence post and watched for longer than he'd intended. When Brooke walked Orca back to the kennel, she passed within a few meters of where he was standing. She didn't look at him. She was watching the dog, talking to him in that low, quiet voice, and Orca's tail was moving in long, easy sweeps and the amber eyes were forward and relaxed. "Calorie," Hargrove said. She stopped. He stood there for a moment in the October grey, hands in his jacket pockets, the equipment shed door still open behind him, and a cold wind moving through the compound. "He looks good," Hargrove said. Brooke looked at Orca. Then she looked back at Hargrove, and her expression was not triumphant and not forgiving exactly. It was something quieter than either of those things. It was the expression of someone who hadn't come here to win an argument. "He's getting there," she said. She walked the dog back to the kennel. Behind her, Hargrove closed the equipment shed door and stood outside it for a moment in the flat cold air, and did not entirely know what to do with the particular feeling of having been wrong about something important. The contract renewal was approved in December. By then, Orca had passed his recertification assessment. Not barely, not with conditions, but cleanly and fully, with a rating from the CFMWD assessor that Fitch read twice and then forwarded to Ottawa without comment, because the numbers were better than his own dog's last review. Brooke drove back to Barrie for Christmas. She was gone for 4 days. She had made arrangements for Orca with the kennel staff, specific arrangements, written out in a document that was longer and more detailed than strictly necessary, and that the duty kennel tech, a young private named Torres, read 3 times because it covered everything from food preferences to what radio station Orca seemed to find least objectionable. On the 2nd day, Torres called her because Orca wouldn't eat. On the 3rd day, he called again. Same problem. On the 4th day, Christmas Eve, Brooke drove back to Trenton, not because she was told to, not because it was required. She drove back because she had started this thing, and she understood, in the way that people who are genuinely honest with themselves eventually understand things, that she hadn't started it for purely professional reasons. She opened the kennel door. Orca looked at her from the back of the run. Then he got up, walked to the front of the run, and sat down in front of her, and his tail swept the concrete in slow, deliberate arcs, and he looked at her with his amber eyes that held light the way old glass holds light. She stayed. In February, a reporter from a regional paper in Belleville called the base looking for a human interest story. Someone had tipped them off, Torres possibly, or one of the other kennel staff, about the dog who'd been days from euthanasia and the contractor who'd driven 4 hours to stop it. Fitch declined the interview. Brooke declined the interview. Hargrove, who had not been asked, mentioned the situation to 3 different people at the mess and did not frame it as a story about a dog and a contractor, but as a story about getting something wrong and the specific kind of accountability that involved actually admitting it. He told it the same way each time, without embellishment, which was how people knew it was true. The reporter eventually got the story through other channels and wrote something that was accurate in the broad strokes and missed almost all of the important details. It mentioned Brooke and mentioned Orca, and described the situation as heartwarming, which was not wrong exactly, just insufficient. It didn't mention Cole Brentwood, which was an absence Brooke noticed when she read it, and then chose not to say anything about in the comments, because Some things are not for correcting in comment sections. It didn't mention the 4-hour drive. It didn't mention the 11 days of paperwork. It didn't mention the Tuesday in October when she stood at a fence line in a flat grey Canadian morning and said one word to a dog who had been waiting 6 weeks to hear a voice he recognized. And the dog's ears came forward, and his tail moved once, and then again, and then he crossed the yard. It didn't mention Hargrove at the fence post, saying he looks good in a voice that was doing several different kinds of work at once. But those were the things that mattered. Those were the things the people who were there still thought about. On quiet days, when they weren't thinking about anything else in particular. A dog who wasn't broken. A woman who knew the difference. And a Tuesday morning in October that nobody who witnessed it ever really forgot.